Welcome everybody. My name's David Wood and I chair London Futurists. Before I turn to the distinguished group of panelists assembled for today's webinar, let me briefly share two somewhat negative assessments of the capability and influence of futurists or practitioners of foresight. These two assessments were contained in the opening keynotes of the two main days of the Dubai Future Forum. The opening keynote on the first main day was given by Amy Webb of Future Today Institute. One of Amy's messages was that foresight has never been more important because, she said, we are all living through a soul-crushing amount of deep uncertainty and the staggering impact of technology on society. And yet, Amy said, foresight isn't having the impact that it needs to have. Companies may be hiring chief metaverse officers, but they generally don't have chief foresight officers. People are working on strategy, but they are focusing near term. And society as a whole is infected by a virus, which she called the virus of nowism. Nowism, in which people are psychologically uncomfortable with exploring alternative future scenarios. That was day one. The opening keynote on the second main day was given by Jamie Metzl of One Shared World. The title of his keynote talk was, "Can we predict the future of our species?" The somewhat negative part of his talk was the answer he gave to that question: no, we can't predict the future of our species. And to illustrate that claim, Jamie went on to mention that 100 years ago, the most famous futurist in the world was, can you name him? H.G. Wells. If you had asked H.G. Wells 100 years ago where we would be having a meeting in 2022 in a city that describes itself as the city of the future, with 400 experts in foresight gathered together, the last place in the world that H.G. Wells would have picked would be in the little fishing village of Dubai. How things change. These unexpected changes can be a matter of celebration rather than a matter for despair. These changes, Jamie Metzl said, are a sign of what can be achieved by a powerful vision of a better future. The government in Dubai have a vision to place foresight studies close to the heart of all their deliberations and decisions. That's why they created the building in which the forum meeting took place, the splendidly architected Museum of the Future. And that's why they gathered so many foresight experts together, asking for our advice. So what was the outcome of that gathering? What were the highlights? And what are the points of possible improvement in follow-up events? Let's now hear the reflections of 5 people who took part in that Dubai Future Forum. The 5 all have extensive biographies, but to save time, I'll restrict myself to very brief summaries. Let's hear first some opening remarks from Ibon Zugasti, member of the board of directors from the Millennium Project. Ibon.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the London Futurists for inviting me and inviting us, the Millennium Project. We are also excited after coming back from Dubai, after having this big gathering in Dubai. And I would like to highlight a few starting points to open this discussion. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Dubai Future Foundation. I think what they have achieved so far, it's really impressive. Not for the level of the let's say the foresight ecosystem they have already created, because we see that there are other examples worldwide that could be already at that level, like Finland, Singapore, Canada, and some others. But especially for the speed in which they have reached this very good level of a foresight, working foresight ecosystem. The whole Dubai Future Foundation and their architecture is really impressive. So we look forward to seeing the results in the next few years. My second point is also second congratulation, and this time to our network, to the Millennium Project, and especially to our executive director Jerome Glenn, for leading the way to get this. As it was announced, we have agreed with the Dubai Future Foundation a 5-year agreement and a memorandum of understanding to start a cooperation, an ongoing cooperation, to try to strengthen our capabilities in futures thinking and strategy. So this is a great news. As many of you might know, the Dubai Future Foundation was signing similar agreements with the APF, Association of Professional Futurists, and also with the World Future Studies Federation. So that's really a great news that we are strengthening the work of the futures networks worldwide. And of course, this could be the first step to create a global future society, following the example we had in the past with the World Future Society. So that's also a very good news from last week. My third point is also on highlighting what's going on at the futures research level worldwide. I think we are also in a turning point. We also are having very good news from the United Nations system. For the first time ever, we see that the UN General Secretary is launching a new strategy called Our Common Agenda that is really highlighting the importance of futures research on planning for the future, not only for governments, but also for the private sector. So there are 5 important elements on that UN our common agenda strategy, on developing a UN summit on the future, UN Futures Lab, strategic foresight reports every year, envoy for future generations, and also a trusteeship council that could also help support the process. So very good news also from the UN side. My fourth point is on other very important initiatives that we were discussing in Dubai, very much related to this at the government level. We are seeing OECD still working on their group of governments that and networks that are trying to exchange best practices on how to apply futures thinking to government's planning. So that's also a great news. We are seeing that also at the EU level with under the leadership of Vice President Šefčovič at the European Commission. And we are seeing similar movements in Latin America, in Asia, and all over the world. So we are moving forward in the right way. And also at the parliamentary side, last week there was a big summit in Finland, gathering the best practices on committees of the future by parliamentary bodies and by similar bodies worldwide. So that's also a great news that the parliamentary legislative side can join these efforts on
Thank you, Ibon. That's a great set of news. We'll come back to you in a moment to hear more about some of this. Bronwyn from South Africa, what's your reflections?
Yeah, so first of all, I would also just commend the foundation for putting together an absolutely incredible event. I think they really did do a good job of scanning the globe and bringing people from different locations together, but also cutting across the different sort of flavors of futurism that we tend to have in this world, from practitioners all the way through to pop futurists. So there's a good slice of what's going on in the world at the moment. I also appreciated how they brought in subject matter experts, which is something that us futurists need to be humble about, that we're not actually domain experts in the various different verticals. We're much more in the horizontal game of connecting ideas together. So it was quite smart of them to get subject matter experts from the world of politics, science, economics to actually present some facts to go together with a lot of the more sort of speculative content that comes out there. That said, I think that perhaps if they're looking for future suggestions, which they did tell me that they really are, I think that they perhaps didn't take full advantage of the opportunity of having a few hundred of the world's most interesting thinkers in one space at the same time to actually solve problems. So to actually set agenda outcomes from the conference, I think they would get more value out of it. And not just them, the global foresight community too. So there were a couple of workshops that took place on the day before the conference started, but the invitations went out quite late. And I think a lot of people missed out on those opportunities. I think if we had more opportunity to solve problems, we could have added more value back to the organizers and sort of paid our own way through the very generous event that they put together. So that would be an overarching reflection. I think the other thing that I want to take away from this is for us to challenge and call each other out on our nonsense. I think I was quite disappointed at some of the absolutely outrageous claims that were put forward by some of the futurists that did get speaking slots across the event. And I would have appreciated the audience actually calling them out on some of those made up statistics, some of those claims that have no justification in reality. And yes, we're supposed to be provocateurs. We're supposed to rattle cages and broaden minds. But at the same time, we're representing an industry, and we need to call each other to account if we are finding people that are perhaps, these are the reasons why people don't take us seriously in the great big world out there, whether it's in the political sense, in the public sector or the private sector. We need to take our platforms very, very responsibly, and we must be sort of honor those opportunities that are given to us and do the job seriously. So that would be a calling out of a couple of the sort of sessions that I sat in on. But overall, I think the event was a great broad slice. I suppose the other comment I had would be more of a content comment, and that would be a case of the fact that most of the voices that were represented on these platforms tended to be the sort of tech futurist voices rather than the human futurist voices. I do tend to try and sort of categorize people's perspectives across this community. Some people believe quite adamantly that technology leads the future. Other people look for the deeper human trends, like myself, going through life. And I think that perhaps the general tone was skewed towards techno optimism, which is a good thing. We need to be optimistic. In fact, there's a moral imperative for us in the future space to be optimistic, because expectations do shape reality. And if we're not optimists, we're actually part of the problem in terms of things turning darker in the future. But I would have also enjoyed hearing some people who see different drivers of change and who are looking at trying to draw pictures as to what the probable and preferable futures are coming from a different perspective. So I think that's a sort of another layer of diversity that we could get into going forward. And of course, the last layer of diversity would actually just to go even further into finding voices in more obscure places. I mean, even me, I'm from South Africa. It was great to see other South Africans at the conference. Africa was represented, but it was still largely represented by my country, which is by no means an accurate representation of the entire continent. So I think we need to share the platform and challenge each other more. That would be my overall takeaway from the conference.
Fascinating. My own take on the technology driving question is that I'm pushing a slogan a lot these days, which is it's time to take back control of technology.
Yeah, we made it. We can change it, right? It belongs to us.
Let's now hear opening remarks from Anders Sandberg, who is a senior research fellow from the Future of Humanity Institute, so obviously thinks about the future a lot.
Yes, and my area is, of course, quite often doom and gloom. And although this was a very techno-optimistic setting, I was very happy to be in the existential risk panel. We were talking about threats that could face humanity. But as I was arguing, you can be rather optimistic about that, because, again, many of the threats are human-made, which means that humans actually have agency over them in various ways. By no means an easy agency. It's not like we can just say, okay, let's not do war. We actually need to resolve a much more complicated social game globally in order to avoid conflicts. But we do have agency, and there is good reason to be hopeful about it, even though I saw some people getting rather nervous when I was bringing up some of my slides of nuclear winter and other dreadful things. So existential risk has gone from being this very marginal thing that many of the optimists didn't even want to touch to something that actually was part of now the program and actually featured rather strongly. Not everybody involved here, of course, use existential risk in the sense I would use for something that means an end point of human history, but might think of it as, well, the end of my nation or the end of my company. But thinking well about that still requires foresight. It's not just making predictions. future studies has for a long time been dealing with making predictions, which are statements about the future, and they might turn out to be correct or wrong, or quite often meaningless. An awful lot of future studies is just entertainment, making nice sounding statements that are very entertaining. But ideally, you want to make statements that are not just possible to be right or wrong, but actually are useful, that actually make you, if you are handling them wisely, better able at taking whatever the right action is. That is foresight. And as Amy Webb said in her opening talk, foresight must evolve. We have gone through various phases on how we do future studies, new methodologies, new voices, some insights, but now it needs to be even more agential. It actually needs to be integrated with, well, what do we do about this situation, rather than making a list of 4 or 5 scenarios and then telling the decision maker, have fun deciding what to do about it. Actually, we need to look at our actions built into this. There is a problem, of course, that many different people want very different things from the future. It's not just entertainment. It might also be that various future objects, so to say, are useful for different things. I was listening in on a panel about terraforming, which was up in the museum's wonderful space exhibition, where the panel was sitting in front of an enormous rotating Earth below them. And half of the panel, they were talking about actual things we could do one day to make Mars more habitable. The other half was talking about inspiring people with stories about space, how this gets people into STEM careers. A lot of very useful things, but actually didn't have any bearing on what you could do on Mars. And in many ways, I think it was a good idea to have a mixed panel like that, make it rather clear that, yeah, we might be thinking about it in very different terms. I might be spending far too much time thinking about carbon dioxide pressure levels, while maybe what I should care about is how do we get more kids interested in doing something useful with their careers. So overall, I think this mixture was very good, but I think we can do more of it. And this was a first iteration. There's things like some of the echoes in the big future hall that were still problematic. There are interesting things that need to be resolved, and this was the first iteration. I'm hoping that this is going to become a regular thing, because then it could become the world's premier meeting of futures thinking.
Thanks very much, Anders. Let's turn now to Katarina Tully, who is the co-founder and director of the School of International Futures. What did you see as the highlights or possible points of issue, Kat?
Thanks very much, David, and it's lovely to connect with people here. It was a real pleasure to be in Dubai for this session, and it's great that they have moved into the gap of the World Future Society, actually, so that it was a well-needed healing and gathering and reconnecting, but it was really interesting, and I think 2 really nice things that I took out of it was the number of young and diverse people in the room, people who hadn't really connected with each other before. And so that was a very strong positive sign that there's a lot of fresh blood coming into the field. And the second thing that I found very interesting is that they're doing really innovative, much more participatory and different types of methodologies and design. Brackets, I wish I'd heard a lot more of that, because what we heard was a lot of conversations from some of perhaps the more well-established people in the field, and actually not as much space where people could actually really understand what some of the kind of cutting-edge innovations from different perspectives around the world are. I think it's really interesting that we came together in 2022 and that people have talked about optimism and pessimism, your point, David, to begin with. Because I found it a really interesting mixture of both, which I think points to an agenda for change for this community. And what's interesting is that it is still quite a community of atomized individuals rather than working as a movement and collectively, I think. And what I found really interesting is that after 2 years of a pandemic where the technological innovation of a vaccine had huge amounts of distribution, equality and access issues, the level of techno-optimism and the kind of just first order exploration of how technology is going to sort X, Y, and Z, you know, along some pretty fundamental frontiers like space and human longevity, without really reflecting on, you know, given what has happened over the last 2 years, do we really think that the majority of the scenarios that were being described actually were feasible, and a lack of connection between that and a reflection on what we globally have gone through over the past 2 years, I thought it was almost as if it was like missing. And I found that really striking. Was it because people didn't want to make the connection? Was it they were embarrassed? What is it that's going on there? But I think that's pretty important to connect, because that's how we're going to reach out to the rest of, like, beyond our very small community and actually connect to others, right? You know, that has to be part of the story of the value add of our community. So I don't think we can ever talk about technology without a very, very, very quick second order conversation about distribution, access, and power. I think the second point that I wanted to make was, and on the more kind of perhaps optimistic side, is, and this is very much building on Yvonne's point, is that over the past 3-4 years, like, there has been a massive sea shift in senior leaders' interest in strategic foresight as a tool to engage with them and make decisions for a time of uncertainty. And Yvonne's done a very nice summary of, you know, across, you know, different senior levels. You talk about it in COP26, what's happening to our children and our children's children. We're seeing citizens, for example, in the UK, 67% of citizens think that, you know, assessing our impact on the future generations is one of the key things that government's needing to do. There's some great research coming out saying that about 28% of CEOs think that future generations are core constituencies, and these trends are just going up. So I think that the conversation has to be really different now, and you know, our community can be a lot more ambitious about what is it that we're trying to achieve, right? And actually be a lot more confident about and assertive, and not just have to kind of go, oh, look at the, you know, look at the evidence and stuff. It's just like, we don't need to, that's not where the world is. Where we're at now, I think in the next 3 to 5 years, is we need to scale up, we need to connect to the different communities, and we need to evidence and engage with them and show how what we do absolutely can add value to them in the here and the now with the things that they're wrestling with.
Thanks.
Sorry, and that's, I think, the agenda that I'd like the kind of community to work on.
We'll come back to that question of what is reasonable to expect in the next 3 to 5 years, whether the potential sea shift in leadership attitudes around the world can be taken advantage of. But first, just to round off the set of introductory remarks, let's turn to Silicon Valley, to Brock Hinsman, who is the chair of the Silicon Valley node of the Millennium Project.
I guess I would say that I would agree with just about everything everyone has said so far. So there's not a lot left to say, but I think in general, I found the conference a really nice overview, if you will. I didn't, as someone who's been doing this for over 40 years, I didn't find anything particularly new. But I also spoke to some people who are new to the futures area, and they seemed to be overwhelmed with how much they were learning in a very short format, really, in just 2 days. And so I think that made for a good balance. It kind of allowed the rest of us to sort of review a long list of methods and issues, and but the younger people were catching up very quickly to, you know, where the rest of us are. I did take some exception to Amy Webb's opening remarks. Most of the work that I've done is for corporate entities and large government agencies, and everything we did was action oriented. But I do agree with the thing that she said about we need to find better measures for measuring and evaluating these plans that we put in place, so that we know when we're making progress or not. So I sort of disagreed with part and agreed with part that measures is one area that we should be benchmarking in some way. there are examples of these things that that have come up, and so I would say I'd want to get some of those more specific things out. So draw in some more people who are doing some of these things that she kind of glossed over. And so part of that has to do with methods. So again, some people reviewed methods that I think was a nice list, but I think there are some other things. Only one person in the week mentioned DALL-E, for instance, as a way to create visualizations of the future. I mean, and that was not in the main program. That was Rohit Talwar who mentioned that in another workshop, that he was using DALL-E to create visualizations of the future. And so there are other methods that I think are out there. There are companies that are promoting chief futures officers. I'd like to hear more about those, especially one company I heard about, all of their CFOs have been teenagers. So there's a thing there where the youth movement is actually having an effect. All these people are getting training in futures methods, are finding jobs in places where they're actually being listened to. I think was it Katharina's session on communicating with generations? Was that yours? I forget. But anyway, I found that whole discussion interesting. And in general, the comment about missing voices, indigenous peoples, third world problems and approaches that are needed, and of course the youth movement. These are all things that I'd like to hear more about in future conferences, drawing those out, using these new methods, and finding out where those things are going and where the values are moving. So a lot of the discussion we've had about all these tech futures and wealth creation and all these kinds of things have been methods or things that come from the past and the past norms and past values. Are these new values, are they really appearing? Are they really changing? Or are we going to see today's youth just sort of do the baby boomer backsliding into, oh no, I got to get a job and make money and blah, blah, blah. Or are there new values and new norms that are really appearing and are going to drive these scenarios in different directions than we would have expected to see? Anyway, I've got a couple of other specific areas that maybe I can bring up in the second round, but
yes. Well, let's move to a second round. Thanks to everyone for putting a whole bunch of things on the table. We're going to go around again. And then after we've gone round again, slightly quicker this time, maybe, we're going to start dipping into whatever the audience is asking us about. But some points I will highlight, just in case people haven't caught the news. There is an agreement to create something called Global Future Society that has currently the Dubai Future Forum and the Millennium Project and the Association of Professional Futurists all signed up, together with two other organizations who have signed a memorandum of understanding, which isn't quite so legally binding. That's the World Future Studies Federation and the Public Sector Foresight Network. And we all here sort of missing the wonderful meetings that used to take place under the auspices of the World Future Society, which for various reasons haven't happened so much in the last few years. So there is change in the institutional level. If you have any comments on that, I'll be interested in. Anders said foresight must evolve. The question is, well, how is it reasonable for it to evolve? Brock said we need better measures rather than just us being entertaining or getting lots of laughs, selling books. How should we actually measure the effectiveness of what we're doing, given that we don't want to wait 20 years to find out whether we were successful or not? So what are the measures we should be doing? Katharina points out that sometimes is too little reflection on the difficulties of past initiatives like the rollout of the vaccine and other things. How should that be brought into the conversation? And I'm sure there are lots of other things that you can build on that each other said. So let's hear some more comments in the same order as before. Ibon.
Thank you, David, and thank you to my colleagues also for the great thoughts. And I also agree with most of what you have said. In my previous point, I was saying that I feel we are in a turning point right now, and we are very excited and happy about what's happening worldwide on futures thinking. That's clear for me. But at the same time, I need to say that in my mind, we are very far still from where we should be. Both at the government side and at the private sector side. If we look at for instance, at the government side, still there are few very good cases that are doing systematic futures thinking. So probably less than 20 governments in the world doing really systematic futures thinking. So we still have a very long way ahead to improve that situation. And also the corporate sector, some of you might remember that we were announcing a new initiative under the Millennium Project to somehow try to attract the corporate sector to our futures thinking. And in both cases, I would say that the task is more on our side, in the side of the futurist, more than in the governments or in the private sector. I personally find that we need to adapt our narratives a little bit more. Mainly at the private sector, I belong to a very large corporation called Mondragon with more than 80,000 people and 12 billion euros turnover. And still, I mean, it's clear that uncertainty is a key driver for us when we are doing planning, but it's not clear at all that futures thinking, scenario planning, and so on are the key tool to improve our decision making and our impact at the long term. So we still need to work a lot on that. At the Millennium Project, one of the discussion points on this new agreement with the Dubai Future Foundation is on a possible upgrade of our futures research methods 3.0 to a 4.0 version. So we are aware that we need to improve those methods. I think we also need to include and integrate more advanced techniques and gaming and new approaches into our methods. Always keeping the grounds of our methods, not changing our methods at all, so that they don't have the core ideas of futures thinking. Of course, keeping the whole original ideas, but adapting them to what the market, let's say, both at the public sector and the private sector is asking for. So let's go for it. I think we need to invest more in futures thinking, and we are at the right moment. As Jerome Glenn said, COVID was the best opportunity for a restart in humanity. And I think this is the great opportunity we have never seen before for the futurists all around the world to take this opportunity on board and to work on it in the next few years.
That's an optimistic assessment. COVID brings a great opportunity for a reset of futures thinking. Bronwyn, what would you like to add to the conversation now?
Actually, back and add another point like that. I think it was quite an important point that came out of the conference, that a lot of the conversations that were had were about borders or lack thereof, and about the fact that most of the grand challenges that are being discussed there, whether it was longevity, whether it was putting satellites in space, whether it's looking at the future of warfare, the future of governance, the future of what money and currency is going to be, these are global questions that affect everyone. And to that end, it's great that there are new global bodies that are being set up in the wake of this, where we're able to start addressing these issues from a global perspective. But I suppose my concern is that it's still almost entirely top down, and it's still quite an elite club. Like, I actually had an argument with one of the panelists in one of the sessions when I was saying that even the UN is not representative of global direct democracy at all. The UN is a reflection of a certain number of countries who have been deemed good enough countries to be part of that network, and who then abide by those decisions. But there are other countries, there are other citizens that aren't fortunate enough to live in democratic countries that are not part of that conversation at all. And I do have a slight concern that a lot of the conversation around futures, whether it's coming from academia, whether it's coming from practitioners, whether it's coming from these sorts of conferences, is still very much top down. And this is why I get quite concerned when I hear talks like Amy Webb's talk about that futurists should be involved in change. I actually want to challenge that point. I'm not sure that is our role. Our role is to inspire change. Our role is definitely not to dictate change. And as soon as we start dictating change, we've actually tainted ourselves. We're no longer useful in a foresight perspective. And foresight is supposed to be about broadening perspectives and about getting more people, more voices, more agency to actually fill out that space. I think there was one of the sessions on sort of decolonizing the future that kind of talks to these ideas. But even that concept of decolonizing the future has kind of a grimy subtext that already says that the future belongs to someone. And at the moment, it's belonging kind of to us. So I think we need to push back on those sorts of ideas and to challenge ideas that sound good, but perhaps when we start to look at the actual incentives in play, the intentions, of course, get completely steamrolled by the incentives that come out when we start to change these conversations. So I'm quite hesitant on our role is to actually change things. Our role is to inspire change, to let other people run with it. And our role is also to include more voices. That is bottom-up voices. It's also different geographic points of the parts of the world, which I've spoken about. Again, me as a white woman representing the continent of Africa is not the ideal way to talk about sort of participatory futures going forward. As much as I love being part of these conversations, I would be very hesitant to say that I'm representative of the continent that I come from. So anyway, those are quite divergent points. Carry on as you were.
Well, fascinating. I'm always struggling myself. Should I be an evangelist or should I be a catalyst? I've heard the word catalyst on my business card. A catalyst is something that's, as you said, inspires change. It allows changes to go faster than they would otherwise. And so a catalyst asks questions and doesn't have answers. But sometimes I feel I know the answers and these people aren't listening. And there are some really important things. Hey, let's pay attention. So sometimes I'm one and sometimes I'm the other. Anders, what would you like to say at this stage?
So one interesting thing was where the elephant in the middle of a gigantic ring-shaped building, which is, of course, democracy. Notice that we haven't even mentioned it, despite going on with the usual things about talking about equality and power, etc. And this is, of course, an interesting and really sensitive issue here. Let's face it, the United Arab Emirates doesn't score great on the democracy index. So you have this awkward situation that quite a lot of us are very much in favor of open societies, grassroots movement, and political freedom. Yet we're also being polite guests. And there were some voices on Twitter that were pointing out this awkward fact. And I think it's appropriate to point out that this is indeed an awkward fact. Indeed, it reminds me tremendously of Stanislav Lem's classic science fiction novel, The Futurological Conference, where the similarities about the absurdity of us in this absurd building and his absurd conference in some South American country, there are a lot of them. Fortunately, we didn't end up getting psychotropic gas on us and ending up in a weird future. But there is an interesting issue here as active futurists, public intellectuals, to think about how do we engage with this? How do we handle these awkwardnesses? And you won't be able to get away from it, saying, oh no, we are not going to go to anywhere that scores below this level on a democracy index. Okay, that's going to limit participation. It's a bit like saying, I'm not going to touch anything touched by a big corporation. Well, good luck using any internet technology. So I think we need an awareness of that and finding good ways of accommodating that without necessarily losing our values. And this is tricky. It can be rather subtle, but again, I think this community might actually be rather good at coming up with ways of both dancing elegantly around the elephants, but sometimes leading elephants. Maybe, could you please stand not in the middle of a room, at least over in that corner?
I think we're going to come back to that elephant. I already see a question from Lucy Kimball in the questions on that subject. We will surely come to that. But let's move quickly to Kat. What would you like to build on the points you've heard?
We were talking a little bit about governance and institutionalizing foresight and avoiding the word anticipatory democracy. And I think exploring and unraveling what that looks like, I think, is a really interesting agenda. And whether we can do that in that kind of forum is also a very good question. Without being influence is a really good question to put on the table, I think. So my observation is that on this really interesting question about, like, to what extent are we part of helping others use the insights that we use? To what extent should we be responsible for the institutionalization, for the integration, for helping people think about the kind of systemic, well, the ecosystem that enables an organization, but not just an organization or government, but also a sector to come together with different Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3 actors coming together to kind of create change. And I think that's, that it feels like there's a kind of, another set of divisions or differences within the community, which is, suppliers of insight, where people come along and say, this is, my view with the substantive insight. There's people who develop interesting methodologies for participation and enabling others to come up with insights. And then there's another set of people who are particularly interested in how do you then take those insights and on the demand side work with people to kind of use it. And I think sometimes, heterogeneity is very useful and wonderful, but having one single word or profession to describe all of those, I wonder if that's amazingly helpful. But I certainly think that being able to, for some of us at least, whether we call ourselves futurists or not, and I do put myself in this camp, to kind of be able to kind of connect to different communities, like the social movement building community or the network weaving communities, or different communities who are out there who are actually trying to create transformational change, who are trying to kind of stop us exceeding our planetary boundaries, and actually getting stuff to happen now. They could benefit so much from really understanding and harnessing a lot of the tools and the insights from the foresight community. So that, for me, I think is a real interesting question, is like, how do we engage and connect with them? My final point around evidence is not amazingly to sweat it. Basically, I think the most powerful ways is to get testimonials of senior decision makers in the here and the now that can tell the story about the counterfactual and why they put time and energy into conducting and commissioning that kind of work, and telling the story, the richness of how that ended up translating into change and why. And I think a series of collective, powerful stories like that would be extremely useful sectoral resource to have.
Like the stories that were told about Shell. Shell developed the original scenarios and arguably helped Shell to avoid some of the troubles that the other sisters, so-called, of the oil industry struggled with. So there are some stories.
But those stories don't. Those stories have dated and don't connect to
Yes.
Gen Z practitioners now. Yeah.
So we need a new set of stories. We'll come back to that as well, where these stories might come from. But let's hear in this round, last but not least, from Brock.
So having worked at SRI International, and where a lot of the work with Shell was done in scenarios back in the 70s, I guess I feel somewhat responsible for that legacy. But I think to turn some of these onto specific examples, I guess, working with corporate executives, I know that a lot of these people are willing to change, but they need some more realistic inputs to how they should change and where they should change. And so I think some of the discussion about methods is how to get them to see things like the strategic or sustainable development goals from the UN, and how they properly align themselves and invest in ESG investments. I think they're looking for input that's coherent and reasonable. And I think there's a lot more we could hear from the corporates about, what they would like to hear from the futurist community that would allow them to work more efficiently and still be in line with these more preferred or desirable futures. And I think there was a big corporate voice missing at this conference. In fact, the conference sort of seemed to avoid controversy, to the point about the government of UAE. I think maybe they deliberately tried to get people to avoid talking about controversial topics. There were very few disagreements or real debates at the conference. And I think we need to get more of that sort of dialogue into future conferences. So that was one issue. On a specific way to maybe play that out, I'm very curious about China's Belt and Road program. And I think that would be a good way to tease some of these things out. What is really happening, and how is it affecting some of the countries along that Belt and Road? So I'd like to hear from some other countries, so Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or Greece or someplace, where that's being affected by these plans that are being made that have assumptions about where the future is going. And that would be sort of a practical way of bringing out some of these issues that the other panelists are talking about. Another one, although we've talked about space being kind of out there topic, literally and figuratively, but I think space is going to be, in practical terms, where a lot of even emerging economies are putting up satellites, are using space communications to measure and track economic developments and technical developments, spying on each other, as well as trying to take advantage of the data to improve their own governance. And so I think space, not in terms of going to Mars or even going to the moon so much as what's the practical, what are the practical applications of using space in development in the relative near term, 30, 40 years as opposed to 100 years. So that's another topic where we could, again, pull in some of these issues about alternative voices, future expectations, and as well as corporate planning that would allow us to have some controversy and, look at alternative futures in that area.
Many thanks. Let's look at some of the questions now, and I'm going to throw up some of them and leave to each of you to comment on maybe one or two of them, but succinctly. There's a simple question, I think. Well, there's a question with a simple answer from Tony Diggle, who says he wasn't able to attend the Dubai Future Forum. Can he see the recordings? And the answer is yes, the recordings are currently available online. If you go to the Dubai Future Forum website, there is a link there called live stream, and I think will give you a live stream of the second day. But if you search around a little bit on YouTube, you will find the whole channel in which there's a recording of day one. Although interestingly, it seems that some of the talks are missing, and I was looking to check my recollections of a certain talk by Michio Kaku, because I couldn't believe quite what I'd heard, and it didn't seem to be present in the live stream. I don't know why. That's an interesting point. So I think that's the answer there, and I do encourage people to make their way through that. Let's look at the question from Lucy Kimball, who says that there is another conference taking place at ASU, Arizona State University, next month on anticipation, and it has an emphasis on justice and indigenous knowledge. To what extent do you think that, panelists, do you think that something in the United Arab Emirates has a chance to be open to such perspectives? Or maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's okay to go there and leave some things out. So what's your views on that?
I have a comment there just to start off with. Like what the Dubai Future Foundation did do is they sponsored travel from a lot of emerging market countries, people to attend those conferences. The Arizona State University, I don't believe, has done that. So, I mean, like, you could talk about where it's happening, but who's actually putting their money and their mouths into trying to bring a community together. I do think that this conference was put together with good intentions. I think that they have done quite a good job of trying to find people to come and to present their views. Are there other layers? Yes, but that's almost up to us to actually put other people forward, because they have selected the people that had public profiles. So they've already gone further than a lot of the other conferences have, where they're pretty much limited to those who have funds and awareness of them. So I think that that's a point worth making.
Anders.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it's also worth noticing that having people sitting around talking about justice, that's safe. This is very much an intellectual forum. That's very different from going out and organizing people to something. And generally, Dubai is very similar in many ways with Singapore. It actually has pretty good governance. And that seems to work for a lot of people. quite often we, especially we in Western left-leaning intellectuals, tend to say, oh no, democracy is super important, but actually a lot of people don't care as long as things work. So generally, I don't think there is a fundamental problem here that certain perspective would not be allowed. I think, however, yeah, there is going to be a bias. There is this subtle effect of, yes, you somebody's guest. But the same thing is probably true for Arizona State University. I bet nobody there at that meeting is going to question the value of indigenous knowledge. Because in many ways, that is a relevant thing. There are some forms of indigenous knowledge that is actually super conservative and actually based on local religious views that were they a large religion would say that's creationism, that's very problematic. But now it's from a relatively powerless group, and then we might say, oh yes, that is local traditions. So we always have this problem. But I think it's an interesting question, what questions cannot be raised. And I think one should always be on the lookout for that, because that's usually where you get the most interesting things to poke around in.
Kat.
To Bronwyn's point, I also wanted to say that DFF actually funded for about 8 of the next generation of foresight practitioners to come along and some others. So absolutely want to kind of pay tribute to the fact that they were actively seeking different alternative perspectives there. I also think it's helpful to draw out 3 differences, I think, between the 2 conferences that might be helpful. One is that I think Arizona, and by the way, I am absolutely squarely in the camp of the social justice and indigenous knowledge as being language and ways of saying that foresight needs to be more engaged with the human trends and less of the technology trends, I think. But I think, firstly, I think as Arizona State is a more multidisciplinary space is my instinct. So there's more systems thinkers, people from outside that kind of, they probably non-identifying themselves as a futures field, but from adjacent fields coming together, including anthropology, etc. It's my instinct. I also think there's something quite interesting about the nature of the fundraising and the funding model, and the fact that the Arizona State University, from my understanding, is probably heavily kind of led by volunteer efforts. And I note that it's a almost all women volunteer committee that's pulled it together. And then I think there's just a final thing, which is that I do think there's kind of quite a difference in the futures field. But I always talk to people outside of the field that there's 2 big underlying metaphors behind what we're trying to do in terms of futures. One is that foresight in our endeavor is a crystal ball. It's like getting it right or understanding objectively. And then the other one is much more about future exercises, endeavors and projects as being about a mirror and trying to bring alternative perspectives to Horizon 1 actors at the here and the now. And I think I would say that the DFF was the former, and I think Arizona State University is much more the latter. Thanks.
And last on this question, Ibon.
I'm trying to answer these questions in the chat and also some comments here in the group. I think we need to separate what a gathering means to what the discussions on the contents mean. So when we are having a conference in the Emirates, or when we are having a conference like I had in the last years in the US or in Russia or in Brazil, it doesn't mean that you are supporting what the government does. Because in many cases, I didn't support what the government was doing. It means that you are okay with discussing with your futurist colleagues about how to improve the futurist practice and the methods and how to do a better foresight at the end. Of course, if the DFF or this Arizona State University or other hosts in other countries would ask us to support their policies or to follow or support publicly a statement that we don't believe in because it's against democracy or whatever, of course that wouldn't be fair, and we shouldn't support such an event or a conference. But here we were talking about coming together to discuss about how to improve futures thinking. And I think it's very important also that we especially try to extend futures thinking to those countries that may perform not so well in terms of democracy, because futures thinking and foresight, it's also a tool to improve performance in democratic ways. We, of course, don't have perfect democracies nowhere. But of course, futures thinking, as we know it, we are talking about participatory methods. We are talking about integrating stakeholders on decision making, and if we do futures thinking in the right way, this is a way also to improve democratic ways. So, of course, for the future, we can think as Dubai Future Foundation and the forum itself, they are planning to repeat this gathering in the future. Of course, we should suggest these key topics to be discussed and to see how we can contribute to an open discussion on these topics.
Thanks. Well, let me know, everybody, which other future events, conferences are worthy of having a debrief event a bit like this after the time comes. There's quite a few high voted questions from Rohit Talwar, another member of the Millennium Project. So let's feed his questions in now, and I'll give you all a chance to pick some of them. What were the most interesting future methods that you heard discussed or introduced? Also, what were the most interesting future factors, ideas, and what might be causing change that we hadn't previously thought about? And last from this set, just to mix things up, Rohit observes that there is a challenge with foresight on this balance. Do we want the eye-catching predictions and forecasts that get media attention of futurists? Or is it more important to do the patient hard work of building a broad consideration of future drivers and scenarios? How do we do that balance? So Brock, you put up your hand first. What would you like to say in response to any of these questions?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Rohit, ironically, was one of the few people that mentioned a process for visualizing futures in his work that I didn't see mentioned particularly anywhere else, except that in general, different ways of visualizing the future, I think, came up in a couple of the presentations. I would add that in the past, I've used industrial designers, for instance, in my futures work, who are able to do fast sketching in workshops and meetings. And I think that's a really good way to flesh out ideas that are discussed verbally or in text in workshops that where you can get a quick reaction. And I think that would actually also be a good way to run a workshop at a conference, is to have some designers come in that have fast sketching skills and able to flesh out the things that are being discussed. People see things visually and they react to them differently than when they hear things or when they see a bit of text. And so that would be one group. And one thing that I've been impressed by at the Arizona State is that their use of science fiction. And science fiction, again, is a way to quickly get a story around a future concept and get a human dialogue around that and human actions and reactions around something. And so quick science fiction sketches or whatever is another way to get people to understand a concept quickly and communicate that to other people who don't necessarily respond well to text, but more to stories. So stories, visualization, and getting products and visualizations around future things. I think anything along those lines, obviously, immersive type techniques or new technologies that are coming along using virtual environments as a way for people to get into an environment with other people and to play around with imaginary concepts in the future rather than be stuck with what we have at hand. So that's just a quick response to Rohit's question.
Fascinating. We futurists, we often say to the world's occupations, hey, your occupations are going to be changed by AI in the future. And then sometimes the audience is cheeky enough to ask, are you futurists going to have your occupations change in the future? And I think you're giving me the answer now, Brock, that these graphics design tools are going to change the nature of how we create scenarios, that scenarios can be created much more quickly and much more vividly. And that's
also
interesting.
They communicate with youth and other people who are, not necessarily, have the full education advantage that we have, some of us have, and allow them to communicate quickly and through pictures and visualizations and actions.
Thanks. Anders.
I would actually like to build on that. So this was not so much something that was in the conference as in the museum itself, which was an interesting experience. At first I was feeling, okay, this is Disneyland. This is using a lot of cool high-tech stuff and doing a lot of this bang. And then I started to notice an interesting pattern. All of the levels of the main exhibitions were trying to get the viewer to actually put themselves into the feeling of actually being in this future and actually playing a part in it. It was a very clear design choice. On the space floor, you could basically use your little arm bracelet to get a job in this future. So you could decide whether you're an asteroid prospector or erecting solar panels or doing traffic control or something else. And then your picture would show up on the wall as a representative of that. On the ecosystem floor, you were participating in interactive things as partially as a researcher, and on the kind of future well-being floor, you were actually experiencing something directly. One can debate how effective this is, but it's pointing at a really interesting way of engaging with the scenario, at least if you have that level of budget and design skills around. We might want to figure out, can we do smaller versions of that works for our own scenarios or our own exercises? I do think that language models and the AI graphic systems are hinting at a world where we could make super rapid sketches that are actually quite effective. Earlier today, I gave a talk about the future of medicine to a local Oxford society. And last night, I realized I need some illustrations. So I asked the Stable Diffusion to make some future doctors in the style of Norman Rockwell, which worked really well. And then I started mixing that with some other science fiction artists to change the styles. So I got a few suitably weird pictures that made for good backgrounds. By this time next year, of course, it's not necessarily going to be surreal pictures. It's actually just going to be a Norman Rockwell illustration of a future cyborg doctor. So I think we're getting tools here, but I don't know whether we are great at adopting them yet. We need to figure out that for ourselves.
Anybody want to come in on the future factors that were heard that you hadn't considered before as big change factors, or on this nasty question or tricky question of balance? Should we be encouraging the rock star predictions, or should we be telling the rock star forecasters to be quiet?
Well, I think we can have both. There's definitely room in the space for people that are more on the end of entertainment and more on the edge of, practice and implementation. But as I said in my opening remarks, we need to call each other out when we are hearing actual nonsense, right? So when there are factually incorrect claims or unsubstantiated predictions, we should be calling that out. We should be engaging with that and not accepting it, right? This makes us more interesting to everyone else too, but it also then allows space for both of those sort of factors of our industry to survive. There's definitely a space for both. There's a demand for it. There's a demand for people to have both content and form. So if we can provide that, so much the better. It doesn't have to be all done by one person, but I'd say we don't need to pick a side there, but we should err on the side of the truth.
Didier Cornell asks you directly, Bronwyn, is one of the questions. He says it may be difficult, but which claims did you hear were not serious?
Oh, I'm not going to go into too many. There was one that stood out for me by some technologists that said within 10 years, 90% of all the jobs that we have right now won't be in existence. And I just want to say to that, in fact, in 5 years, 90% of all the jobs we have will be out of existence. And that's a complete nonsense claim, because look at the size of the world. Maybe in a particular industry, in a particular organization, you can justify those sorts of strong claims where you're actually starting to put predictions onto it. But you absolutely cannot do that in a world where there are still agricultural societies, where most of us will still be involved in some form of sales and marketing. Let's be honest, those sort of functions aren't going anywhere anytime soon, nor have they through most of humanity's past. And those sorts of shiny claims get put into the covers of magazines and articles, but also they make us look silly to corporate and to state actor clients, because they know that that's not a true claim, even if we all nod along and smile and pretend that it totally is, because it gets us booked.
Okay. Anybody else want to come in on that? Should we look at another question? Or Anders, one comment here?
Yeah, so I think there is an interesting problem, because I heard several people say things that made me cringe, in the sense that, oh yes, I agree with your conclusion.
But the
It's
principle.
just that either you leave out how you got there, or you have some very loose argument that I don't buy. The later I could at least call out so on. But the real problem is just jumping to a conclusion, and many of us are trying to be careful with the truth and uncertainty. So every time I heard some celebrity futurists say, by 2045 we are going to have this, that is really annoying. At the same time, there is this problem that quite a lot of time you don't have the time. Actually filling out why you believe certain things is really complicated. Many of the best forms of forecasting and foresight we have today, for example, in form of super forecaster, they can't even qualify that. They get a lot of information, use multiple models in a messy way. At that point, it's very hard to even explain why you come to believe that the probability of this happening is this large, even though empirically we can tell that this particular super forecaster is actually doing a pretty decent job at forecasting that domain. So there is this issue both outwards, how much grand claims do we make? There is the issue inwards, how much time do we spend on trying to give the motivations for weird ideas we have? And I think that is an important ongoing debate, and it might be that we need maybe a little sign, maybe we should next time have a little sign saying, please expand on that or not.
Well, I think this is the difference between forecasting and foresight, right? Like a forecast is pinning something to a number, but that's not the role of the futurism industry. Our role is forecast, or it's foresight, so it's supposed to go broader, not narrower, right? Like we're supposed to hold space for different things. When you start making strong claims, what I think annoys me the most about the strong claims is, firstly, some of them are just absolutely unjustifiable, and they're clearly just there to provoke a response from the audience, like to be clickbait, right? So that's annoying in one sense. But the other thing that is annoying on a more serious level is, like, my training is in economics, and a lot of economic policy is based on the fact that expectations change behavior. When we start to make strong claims, we are changing people's behavior, and we're actually taking agency away from people. This is the problem with a lot of our leaders that we have from economics and from politics. They make strong claims, and as such, we adjust our behavior according to those strong claims that are made about our future. It's disempowering, and it's not inclusive. It's kind of the opposite of our role in industry. There are an awful lot of people making forecasts. There are economists and politicians coming out of our ears. There's many financial planners out there. The world doesn't need more of those. The world needs more space, and more voices getting involved in this. So anyway, that's a sort of my kind of personal sermon on the expectation reality question, and avoiding strong claims if we are actually going to do our industry justice.
Thanks. Kat?
And this is building on the discussion here. I think there's something about being quite sensitive about what we communicate lands with the audience, and understanding who is the audience. We've talked quite a lot about clients, corporates, governments, but I think there's also other communities, and just being aware and flexing and kind of connecting those messages to the people that we're working with, including, I think, increasingly social movements or groups of people who are within a sector trying to create change and they hear the same thing in very different ways, right? So like the incumbents, Horizon 1 actors, that even early adopters amongst them might be very different to kind of entrepreneurs. Let's take, for example, the food security space or the humanitarian space, or it's just like when we're understanding how those messages come across and have impact, I think should be part of our consideration about what we say, because that there is a responsibility there, which is back to my point about, you can't really accrue the benefits to thinking about the future and technology without putting a very heavy sodding caveat, God, given the past 2 years. So I think that's I think something interesting to explore, and perhaps something I'd like to come back to later, which is, given the kind of turbulence of the space and the field at the moment, the big opportunities and the changes that are happening with the different people involved and the other communities that want to use foresight and engage, I wonder what role there is for kind of norms of responsible foresight that actually kind of very much put the power, voice, diversity piece at the core, and acknowledge that this is actually the business that we're in, especially since there's a strong incentive at the moment for like performative foresight, which makes everybody feel as if they've done it, but actually doesn't really grab or change anything around us at all.
Thanks. PNJ is asking about, was there something at the forum on the whole question of improving our large-scale infrastructure? So his view is that many points of progress for the future depend on improvements in the infrastructure, whether it's currencies, smart roads, specialist higher education, possibly improvements in how democracy works. Did you hear anything, any of you at the conference, that made you think, this could apply here in improving our infrastructure in any aspects?
I don't think there was too much conversation on that particular topic. I think there was the one conversation that was around how we manage or measure wealth in the future, because obviously what gets measured gets managed, gets manipulated. And some of the suggestions there were to use things like knowledge as a form of currency, which of course gives massive warning bells to someone like myself. When you turn something unfungible into something fungible, we have a whole different sort of layer of monitoring and, again, manipulation of people that sounds very good when you kind of look at it from a superficial level. When you drill down into these ideas and how they work in practice, we really are talking about sort of favoring endowments over ability or merit or ambition, which is, as much as we do have problems with our capitalist system and all the rest of it, the one thing money does have going for it in and of itself right now is that there are many ways to obtain it. You can obtain it from many different starting points. So although it's not fair, the points are at least fair, right? So when we start to try and codify and pointify and essentially rate people, because that's what money systems do, sort of our worth and status in society based on endowments that we have really no ability to change. I do question this, and I think that these are sort of debates that more people should be involved in. So I think that the conversations were there. We could have had more about those sorts of conversations about the systems and structures that we're building and that we're proposing and pitching as we go forward. I probably just confuse people about that. But
No.
Don't worry, get in touch afterwards.
There are important questions, but no one conference can address all of them.
But there wasn't much talk on infrastructure. It was much more about specific projects like space travel or like future of actual travel using passports, for example.
It wasn't discussed, I guess, in a lot of detail, although it was kind of implied. A lot of work or things that people do are not measured by the money system, the economic system, and so we tend not to value those activities. And so I think in general, futurists have been having discussions about how to measure value and what people value. I've had a whole discussion around money as stored energy, for instance, and how you use money to concentrate energy and transport it somewhere else in the world and re-release it. When you spend that money, you release energy, and then time. And time is money. So how do people value their time or time? So time, money, energy is kind of some sort of formula that may be changing or evolving as people's values and what they want to do with their lives is changing. And that's why I asked the question about new norms and values. Is that really changing, or are we just falling back on the old wealth norms and money and that, as we've done it in the past? So there is a sense that people are quitting work, and not valuing work, or valuing their time more than time doing other things rather than time doing work. And how is that changing? Those are the kinds of discussions in general that we seem to be having as a result of the pandemic and some of the other things that are going on in the world. So, like I say, there's kind of an undercurrent of conversation, but I haven't seen anything really specific dealing with it.
I'll come to Ebon in a moment. I'll just mention that I noticed something when I arrived, which is that there was a session organized on that day beforehand on replacements to GDP. And I suddenly thought, oh, if I'd known about this before, I would have tried hard to get myself into that. Except that, of course, I had other Millennium Project activities at the same time. So there was some thought there, but we need to do better at digging out the conclusions of all these sessions. Ebon, what was the point you wanted to make?
Yes, just answering the question, which is a difficult question, because I agree with my colleagues that I don't have the feeling that there was a deep discussion on infrastructures. But I was talking to many colleagues during the forum on the importance of the museum itself on talking about infrastructures. We probably need more museums of the future in many other places in the world to raise an awareness of the need for future thinking. We are discussing about the role of future thinking in secondary school, at the college. We've been talking a lot on futures literacy, but I think that infrastructures like the Museum of the Future play a very important role. And this could be, of course, improved, but also replicated in many other countries. And then a small comment also, there was, I think, a question about the methods. I think it was Freud probably asking, and this was the place to discuss about methods at the forum. Of course, this is a gathering to talk about the methods, to see how we can improve them. Because myself, I also had a lot of disagreements on many things that I heard during the forum on methods themselves. When I heard from one of the first speakers that the trends analysis, I love the trends analysis, that this is the perfect tool for the corporate sector, for the private sector. And I think we futurists should say that this is a first step to futures thinking, because if we agree that the futures thinking is about helping us identify what we don't know that we don't know, then trends analysis is not enough, as we know. This is only a first step, and this is why I was highlighting that we need to find this balance in between making the methods and the tools more attractive, especially for the private sector, but at the same time keeping the real grounds of futures thinking alive, and not forgetting about what is the function the foresight and futures thinking does when helping us, for instance, with the scenario planning, connect cause and effect. And so on. So let's try to find this real and good balance in between upgrading the methods, but also keeping the origin alive.
One of the comments that Amy Webb had made in her opening keynote was that businesses quite like to hear trend reports, but they dislike hearing scenarios because scenarios makes them think more uncomfortable things. And so we should certainly have good analysis of trends, which trends are more likely, what could accelerate trends, what could decelerate and cause breaks, but we're coming into our own when we have scenarios which can in various ways engage people's thinking and overcome their initial fear or future shock. Let's try and squeeze in a couple more questions before we run out of time. There's a question from Gordon Silverman about education, and he's tasked with preparing a course on AI. And he knows that many of his students are going to say, well, Why should we be learning AI? It's changing the world and we may not have a job soon. Gordon's asking, was there something at the conference that highlights how we should be teaching people better in the future? Or was there not much on education? Did anybody pick anything up on that?
There were a few sessions that were dedicated to that, so intergenerational foresight and to asking how governments can be involved in training people and their whole sort of societies in futures thinking. So I think they did cover that question. They again, I'd probably direct you then, just to keep it short, to the actual live stream that has been published on YouTube if you're interested in those conversations. But that was one of the topics on the agenda that came up more than once.
Intergenerational foresight.
I think generally there were many nods to education. Many of us are, after all, involved in education one way or another in our jobs. In many ways, being in the futurist domain means that you're doing an enormous amount of education. If nothing else, we're acting as pollinators, moving knowledge from one place to another. But when it comes to kind of telling the story about AI, I think part of the power in the future is going to lie to the people who can give the right commands to AI systems, to know how to herd the bots, who know what they're good at and bad at, and why they're behaving like that. Many of the big problems we see in data science today is when people don't look at the data, don't understand what the data is, and then just go for what the standard package algorithm tells them to do with it. So it seems like the way of ensuring that your job actually remains in the future is to be able to ask these critical questions. That requires having a bit of understanding of both the history of the field, some of the techniques, and then why it historically gone wrong. And that gets back to that early interesting question. How do we follow up predictions? I think we have far too few retrospectives where we investigate what was predicted and forecasted and how did it turn out. And now when we know what went wrong and what went right, can we actually check whether the methods were good or bad? We generally don't do that because most of the time it's very hard to even falsify the claims about the future. But it is valuable to try to do that, even for the non-falsifiable ones, to get that retrospective discussion.
Kat?
When I was in Dubai, I caught up with Giulio Quadrotti, who is quite an interesting person that's kind of bridging the development, social justice, AI, and futures and policy space. And he's actually been brought in. He helped the PMO in Dubai really get into futures work about 10 years ago and supported Noah in this whole process. And he's now actually in Dubai with his Ministry of Possibilities, which is quite interesting structure. Anyway, he just shared his concerns around AI.
So obviously in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence. So I hear a lot of things. One of the comments that I found intriguing is Jensen Huang, who's the head of NVIDIA, who said that when you look around the world, very few, a tiny percentage of the population is actually programmers or people able to program, but virtually everyone has something to teach. And so his notion is that one of the values of artificial intelligence is to work with people who have something to teach and aren't programmers, and allows them to communicate and teach what it is they have to teach, whether it's somebody on a Pacific island or or someone at in Washington D.C. Everyone who isn't a programmer should be able to augment what they are doing in terms of teaching things. So the jobs of the future in AI will have to do with creating these human AI interfaces that allows the human to understand, to communicate what they're trying to teach, and the AI understanding that, and also the AI feeding back so that the human can understand what the AI is thinking. So there's a whole lot of different jobs that are going to be created in the area of maintaining the AI, assuring that there's not data bias, questioning the algorithms, constantly keeping them up to date. a friend of mine who's one of the researchers at IBM Watson had said that the minute we deploy a new AI, it begins to die because the data begins to change. The algorithms have bias in them that become accentuated. And so there's going to be plenty of jobs for people to just maintain the AIs and understand what the heck's going on inside of them. And so those are a couple of different areas I would look at in terms of the future of AI and jobs.
So there are some optimistic answers in there. And that brings me to the final question. I think we do need to wrap this up. So I'm going to give each of you maybe 90 seconds for closing remarks, and if you, 2 minutes at the most, but maybe we can address the question that Didier Cornell has posted. What are the optimistic proposals from this community of futurists that we think politicians should be listening to, or possibly that scientists should be listening to? So what are the stories that, or the facts or the findings or the possibilities that deserve more attention? And whilst you're all thinking of your answers, and we'll go around the same order as before, I'll just make a point from Michel Zappe in the chat that there's actually a movement of futures museums, which I didn't know about. It's not just Dubai, there's Berlin, there's Rio, and there's Tokyo. And if you go to forms.international, doesn't look like a normal URL, but maybe you can have a URL like that these days. Forms.international, you can find about that movement of futures museums. Anyway, final thoughts or grounds for optimism? Ibon.
Yes, my final thought is that what I was talking about at the beginning, that what we learned from COVID is that we cannot anymore plan the future without using a scenario, multiple scenario approach or foresight approach. This is what we learned. The future is not an extension of the past, or shouldn't be an extension of the past. So we have a great opportunity for this restart, and let's go for a foresight approach.
Interestingly, one comment on the YouTube live stream takes issue with that. It's from Eugene, who says, why is futurism always about radically changing as much as possible? Isn't there room to maintain more traditional and positive aspects of society? So it's not that we need to do things differently. So, but no, good point, Ibon. The role of futurism in raising new ideas is very important given the troubled times, challenging times we're in. Bronwyn, final comments from you?
I just agree with that comment that I definitely don't think futurism is about changing everything. It should be about asking questions, about asking why we have done things, like good old Chesterton's fence, right? Some things are there for a reason, and we should ask why we have them before we dismantle them. At the same time, we must ask why we are doing things that are slowing us down and that are getting us bogged down. So we need to ask questions what we have done and what we're going to do, and to think through those unintended consequences. That's really all we can do. To come back to the question of optimism, it is kind of my current theme of the year, is that there is this moral duty to view all changes, whether they're political, technological, economic, from an optimistic lens. That's not from a gullible lens, but rather from understanding that pragmatic optimism is a moral duty, in that our expectations do shape the decisions that we make. So we have to be approaching any challenges that we see from a problem solving rather than from a sort of, falling into the trap of being quite pessimistic, because if we are pessimistic, we essentially paralyze ourselves. We're not able to move forward. And we do need momentum, as we discussed today. Like, if our role is not actually change management, something that I would disagree with, perhaps other people do agree with, our role is definitely to catalyze change, and to catalyze the overall change, not just for individuals, but for societies at large. I think my last closing comments here would be, I would like to see our industry spending more time talking with people than talking about people. I think that there's a lot of space in terms of participatory futures. One of the projects I'm involved with at the moment is with Nick Bagmington over at futurist.com, where we're just starting to get involved in a project that we're titling the 1,000-Year Project, asking everyone, not just professionals and practitioners, but also school children and people in the media and young people and people across the world, to actually start getting involved in thinking about far, far futures, because that's such an empowering thing. So spend more time talking with people and less time talking about them at these lofty sorts of summits.
Well, on the subject of far, far futures, who better to turn to than Anders Sandberg for closing remarks?
Yeah, I had great fun explaining a bit of a long-termist perspective, which is, of course, an interesting topic to bring up here. But what I would like to add is also something I tweeted about when I was seeing this light-of-an-air robot looking a bit like a seal floating around in the lobby as we were having lunch, under a vaulted ceiling filled with futuristic Arabic inscriptions. And I said, this is beautifully absurd. And I think that is true for this entire conference, the entire museum. It's a beautifully absurd situation. You have people in traditional Arab clothing going out from the Starbucks and getting admonished by a little humanoid robot for not wearing a COVID mask. And normally, absurdity means that it's something illogical, but actually there are reasons for things, not always good reasons, but there are reasons for why the world looks like it does. And this interplay between these hidden reasons generates the absurd world we're observing and the apparent illogic on the visible level. And what we're trying to do is, of course, understanding what's going on behind the surface and where it's going. And this is where foresight does come in, trying to discern the relevant logics and either anticipate their effects or to change the logics. So I do think there is something just inspiring about the sheer absurdity of the whole event, and I'm very thankful for that.
And praise of the beautifully absurd, which can help us to change our logic. Fascinating. Kat, what's your final comments?
I've just put a link to the next generation foresight practitioners there, and I think what you see is half of them doing traditional a third of them doing traditional futures work, a third of them doing some really new innovative practices. So check out their work, including Lotus, so very, very different new types of methods, and then a third of them using it to kind of change their communities around particular topics or issues that they really care about. And I think, so I think that left me with a very positive sense of optimism for the future of the field. The second point I'd say is that there was a growing theme and set of trends around, or conversations around, innovative institutions and thinking about foresight as an ecosystemic approach to bringing different types of communities together. And that also felt like quite a positive step forward too.
Many thanks. And just to tell people who are not aware that you are heavily involved in this nextgenforesight.org project, which is to encourage and support people from the next generation of foresight, not just the same old names, but people who can bring new ideas, new methods, new insights.
Especially from the global south, yeah.
Especially from the global south. Thanks. Brock, final comments from you. Are you optimistic? Do you see messages you would like to tell to politicians or to scientists?
Well, I guess I would say in my career, I'm generally a pessimist, if not, well, at least a conservative, or what did Bronwyn call it? A practical conservatism or something, practical futurism. So I found that I make forecasts more accurate if I'm a little bit conservative, particularly technology forecasts and these kinds of things. But I think in terms of the conference, I keep allowing myself to be influenced by the overwhelming optimism of most of the people who engage in this field. So I think that's a positive sign. And then I think the other thing is education, that there was an awful lot of discussion about education, younger people using methods to train people in futures method and critical thinking skills. So I think I have some optimism in terms of the next generation coming up and people from various parts of the world who are jumping into this field and making their voices heard. And so that also makes me optimistic that eventually somebody has to listen to all these voices and make some positive change. So as a natural pessimist, I'm more optimistic than I was. How's that?
That conforms to my general observation that any serious discussion about the future always gravitates to a serious discussion about the future of education. I have my own vital syllabus project as an outgrowth of London Futurists. Some members of the Millennium Project are potentially involved in that as well. It's a way to answer some of the questions about where is the clear, freely accessible, engaging, focused and reliable. That is trustworthy information about the future. And each of us here on this panel have got our own favorite sets of information. I'm trying to coordinate and curate some of that so that newcomers to this field don't have the reaction that I saw one of the audience members had. Frederick says, gosh, this is a little bit overwhelming, isn't it? Those of us who are used to this field thrive in it. Those of us who are quite new get overwhelmed. So let's try and set that up. That's vitalsyllabus.org. Well, we've had the debrief. In a moment, some of us are going to have a debrief of the debrief. I mean, some of us have got other things to do with our lives, but a few of us can hang around after a short bio break, maybe recharging our coffee cups. I will be open to comments from whoever is still in the audience. I will promote audience members, if they wish, into full panelists for brief conversations, but I understand many people will need to go. So let me finish by thanking Brock, Yvonne, Bronwyn, Anders, and Katerina very much for sharing their insights. We have not answered all the questions by any means. This is an ongoing conversation. As Bronwyn said, anyway, we're not telling people the answers, but we're trying to inspire them to work out better solutions by themselves. So I hope that's what we've done today. So thanks to everybody, and goodbye from me.